Hi, I'm Dr. Garrett Ryan. Thanks for tuning in to Told in Stone. For 500 years, Rome was the world's greatest and most impressive city. For 1,000 years after that, Rome was the world's greatest and most impressive quarry. The worst destruction took place during the Renaissance, when ambitious popes and nobles tore dozens of ruins apart for their building material. This video explores 5 of the greatest casualties, which included a fountain that was 100 feet tall, a temple with columns the size of redwoods, and the Emperor Constantine's masterpiece. Number 5. The Temple of Minerva. A series of emperors constructed magnificent public plazas just north of the Roman Forum. These complexes, known collectively as the imperial forums, were among the most impressive places in Rome. They gleamed with marble, they glittered with bronze statues, and most of them were centered on an imposing temple. The smallest of the imperial forums was no exception. It was built by the Emperor Domitian, who was a tyrant but knew his way around a pile of marble. After Domitian was assassinated, the forum was rededicated to his successor Nerva. It consisted of a long and narrow plaza, dominated at the north end by a temple of Minerva. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the Temple of Minerva and the rest of Nerva's forum were gradually overtaken by decay. Farmhouses were constructed in the grand marble precinct, and the columns and walls around the forum collapsed into heaps of stone. The Temple of Minerva, however, survived almost intact until the Renaissance. Several artists drew the ruins, showing the proud Corinthian colonnade and the cella behind it. In 1606, however, Pope Paul V ordered the temple demolished for building material. One huge block of marble became part of the altar of St. Peter's Basilica. The columns were cut into slabs and used to decorate a new fountain. The rest of the marble was built into the walls of the Borghese Chapel in Santa Maria Maggiore, where it still gleams today. Number 4. The Septizodium. The Palace of the Emperors was designed to impress, and it usually succeeded. Its reception rooms were over 100 feet tall and surrounded by a vast maze of gardens, chambers, and baths. Since the palace covered almost the entire Palatine Hill, later additions had to be constructed on colossal buttresses jutting up from the valley below. At the beginning of the 3rd century CE, after another extension of the palace, the Emperor Septimius Severus decided to build an ornamental facade in front of these substructures. And, as a Roman emperor, he didn't do anything halfway. The facade Septimius built, which faced one of the great Roman highways, was known as the Septizodium. It was enormous, about 100 feet tall, and perhaps as much as 500 feet long, and it was decorated with dozens of marble columns from every corner of the empire. Statues of the 7 planetary gods stood in the first story, haloed by the spray of fountains issuing from marble spouts. Early in the Middle Ages, the central part of the Septizodium collapsed. The surviving sections, 2 towering spires of stone, were both fortified and eventually integrated into a huge castle. In the 13th century, during a petty war between 2 Roman clans, one of the surviving sections of the Septizodium was destroyed. The other, smaller section survived until 1588, when Pope Sixtus V ordered it torn down for, you guessed it, building materials. The stone was used all over Rome and can still be seen in the eponymous 4 fountains of the Via Quattro Fontane, in the facade of St. John Lateran, and in the chapel that Pope Sixtus added to Santa Maria Maggiore. Number 3. The Baths of Constantine. The Romans loved their baths. Rich or poor, every Roman who could take the time spent part of their afternoon at a bath, exercising, socializing, and sometimes even bathing. By late antiquity, there were almost 1,000 bath buildings in Rome. Most were small, but a handful were gigantic complexes, or thermae, able to hold thousands of bathers at once. The Baths of Constantine were the last great bathing complex. Like most large baths, they consisted of a central building, which contained the hot and cold pools, and a series of exercise yards, ringed by an elaborate enclosure wall. Although the soaring vaults and domes fell into ruin during the Middle Ages, the Baths of Constantine were still standing in the 16th century. Contemporary drawings show two large rotundas and high stone walls. Between 1605 and 1621, however, Cardinal Scipione Borghese, the very wealthy and very corrupt nephew of Pope Paul V, demolished the ruins to make room for his new palace, now the Palazzo Rospigliosi. The cardinal's builders simply leveled the ground, leaving the foundations and service chambers of the baths intact underground. When these were uncovered by a street-widening program in the late 19th century, excavators found several perfectly preserved statues, apparently hidden in the bath's basement sometime in late antiquity. The most famous of these statues, the so-called seated boxer, can be seen in Rome's Palazzo Massimo Museum. Besides statues, the only remains of the Baths of Constantine now visible are fragments of the foundations, incorporated into the basement of the Palazzo Rospigliosi. Number 2. The Temple of Hercules and Dionysus, also known as the Temple of Serapis. The most impressive temple in Rome was a mysterious structure that stood atop the Quirinal Hill. There are two competing theories about its identity. Some scholars think the temple was built by the Emperor Septimius Severus and dedicated to Bacchus and Hercules. The opposing view is that it was constructed by Septimius' son Caracalla and dedicated to Serapis. Whoever built it, and whichever god it honored, the temple was enormous. It was the only temple anywhere to have 12 columns along its facade. Most temples had only 4 or 6. Each of those columns was more than 70 feet tall and 6 feet thick. To give you an idea of how gargantuan that is, the columns of the Pantheon are only 40 feet tall. The front of the temple faced a large courtyard. Its rear was connected to the Campus Martius, more than 70 feet below, by a grandiose double stairway. Despite its grandeur, the Temple of Serapis became a white elephant fairly quickly. It was already being plundered for building material a century after its completion, and was likely a ruin by late antiquity. The remains of its soaring walls, however, were fortified during the Middle Ages, and a defensive tower was built atop one corner. By the 16th century, when the temple began to be drawn by artists, all that remained was one corner of the facade and the broken remains of the grand staircase. These ruins dominated the neighborhood until 1630, when they were demolished to make room for an expansion of the Colonna family's palace. Little remains today of Rome's most magnificent temple. The brick and concrete substructures of the grand staircase can still be seen in the courtyard of the Pontifical Gregorian University. And in the gardens of the Palazzo Colonna are 2 gargantuan fragments of the temple's entablature. One of these fragments, a block more than 15 feet tall and 100 tons in weight, is thought to be the largest piece of marble in Rome. And finally, number 1, Old St. Peter's Basilica. You might have seen this one coming, since Old St. Peter's was undoubtedly the most famous Roman building demolished during the Renaissance. Even contemporaries who admired the new basilica were shocked by the destruction of Christendom's greatest church. The old basilica had, after all, been begun by Constantine himself, and had accumulated 12 centuries of offerings and sanctity. Old St. Peter's was a basilica with a transept, in other words, a long hall crossed at the altar end by a narrower hall. At 350 feet long and nearly 125 feet high at the gable, it was the largest early Christian church. Visitors entered the basilica through an atrium, an open courtyard, centered on a fountain and liberally studded with medieval tombs. Rows of columns divided the interior of the church into 5 aisles, which culminated at the glowing marble screen around the high altar and tomb of St. Peter. Dozens of chapels opened from the outer walls, alternating with clusters of ancient and medieval tombs. Old St. Peter's was demolished in 2 stages. The western half was torn down by Pope Julius II in 1506. A few precious fragments were saved. Much more, however, was destroyed in a frantic rush that earned Donato Bramante, the architect, the nickname Maestro Ruinante, Master Wrecker. The eastern half of the old basilica was demolished a century later, in 1606. The reigning pope, Paul V, considered trying to save this part of the building and convened a council to consider the question. The council reported that the walls were on the point of collapse and recommended demolition. The pope agreed. The process was more methodical this time and documented by the pope's secretary. It was, however, equally destructive. The tombs of dozens of ancient and medieval popes were torn to pieces. One ancient sarcophagus was used to mix mortar. Another became a horse trough. As I describe in my video on the hidden history of St. Peter's, many parts of the old basilica were incorporated into the new. There is no denying that the current church is one of the most magnificent structures ever built. But one regrets that so much had to be destroyed to create it. Well, that's a wrap. For more on these buildings, and much more on ancient and Renaissance Rome, check out toldenstone.com. You might also be intrigued by my forthcoming book, Naked Statues, Fat Gladiators, and War Elephants, Frequently Asked Questions about the Ancient Greeks and Romans. If I may say so myself, it is a ripping good read. I've got more videos in the pipeline, so stay tuned, and as always, thank you very much for watching.